Australia. See also, Australia in World War II. During the war, Australia felt abandoned by London and moved to a close relationship with the US, playing a support role in the American war against Japan. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin stated, "I make it clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." 48 U.S. President Roosevelt ordered General Douglas MacArthur to move the American base from the Philippines to Brisbane, Australia. By September 1943, more than 120,000 American soldiers were in Australia. The Americans were warmly welcomed, but there were some tensions, including the so-called Battle of Brisbane. MacArthur worked very closely with the Australian government and took command of its combat operations. Fighting continued throughout Southeast Asia for the next 2 years. MacArthur promoted a policy of island hopping for his American troops while he suggested that the Australian troops should continue clearing and rounding up the Japanese from New Guinea, New Britain, Borneo, and Bougainville. 49. The Canberra Pact of 1944 between Australia and New Zealand was criticized in the United States. Canada. See also, Canada in World War II and military history of Newfoundland during World War II. Canada's declaration of war drew criticism from some American isolationists. 50. With noted American isolationist Charles Lindbergh attacking Canada for drawing the Western Hemisphere into a European war simply because they prefer the Crown of England to the independence of the Americas. 50-51. However, most American isolationists who were critical of Roosevelt's for assisting the British were unable to levy the same criticism for assisting Canada. 52-53. After the fall of France, concerns that the British may be defeated grew in North America, prompting military meetings between Canada and the United States in July 1940. 47. On 16 August 1940, the two countries entered into the Ogdensburg Agreement, which outlined plans for the mutual defense of North America, as well as the establishment of the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. 47. Initially, the plans for mutual defense included the Americans assuming command of Canadian forces in the event of an invasion. However, as the situation improved for the British in 1941, revised defense plans saw the Canadian government refuse to defer command of its forces to the Americans. 47. The need to develop necessary facilities in northern Canada saw 33,000 American soldiers and civilians working in that region during the war to build the Alaska Highway, the Canal Pipeline, and military airstrips for aircraft flying to from the Soviet Union. 47. The large American presence in northern Canada raised concerns for the British High Commissioner to Canada, who notified Mackenzie King of the potential implications the American presence could have on its sovereignty. 47. A special commissioner was appointed by the Canadian government in May 1943 to monitor American activities in northern Canada and report it back to Ottawa. In December 1943, the Canadian government stated it would purchase all military installations constructed by the Americans in Canada during the war to prevent the Americans from retaining the properties. 47. As opposed to the United Kingdom and the other dominions of the British Empire, Canada maintained relations with Vichy France until November 1942. 47. Relations were maintained with Vichy France as the British wanted to maintain an open channel of communication with its government. 47. The Canadian government was involved in a brief diplomatic incident between the Free French and the United States after Charles de Gaulle captured Saint-Pierre and Miquelon from the local Vichy regime. 47. As the territory was nearby Newfoundland, the American government demanded that Canada remove the Free French from the islands, although the Canadians made no efforts to do so. 47. However, the Canadian government did not formally recognize Free France as the legitimate French government until October 1944. during de Gaulle's visit to Montreal, 47. New Zealand. See also, Military History of New Zealand during World War II. This section does not cite any sources. Please help improve this section by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. December 2021. Learn how and when to remove this message. The Labour government had been critical of the fascist powers, voicing opposition to the Second Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. During the war, New Zealand assumed responsibility for the defense of some British colonies in the Pacific on behalf of Britain. The Canberra Pact of 1944 between Australia and New Zealand was criticized in the United States. South Africa. See also, Military History of South Africa during World War II. At the outset of the war in September 1939, the fears in London that South Africa would take the advice of Prime Minister J.B.M. Hertzog and remain neutral were relieved when the South African Parliament voted 80 to 67 for war, and Hertzog resigned. 54. United States. Further information. Foreign Policy of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Administration and Franklin D. Roosevelt Section, 3rd and 4th terms, 1940–1945. See also, Military History of the United States during World War II. President Roosevelt tried to avoid repeating what he saw as Woodrow Wilson's mistakes in World War I. 55. Wilson called for neutrality in thought and deed, while Roosevelt made it clear his administration strongly favored Britain and China. Unlike the loans in World War I, the United States made large-scale grants of military and economic aid to the Allies through Lend-Lease, with little expectation of repayment. Wilson did not greatly expand war production before the declaration of war. Roosevelt did. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines on December 7, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan the following day, December 8, 1941. Roosevelt often mentioned his role in the Wilson administration, but added that he had profited more from Wilson's errors than from his successes. 56, 57, 58. Picture of UN building in New York. The major long-term goal of Roosevelt's foreign policy during the war was creating a United Nations to resolve all world problems. 1941 and 1942. After Pearl Harbor, anti-war sentiment in the United States evaporated overnight. The nation was now united on foreign policy. On December 11, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, which responded in kind. Roosevelt and his military advisors implemented a war strategy with the objectives of halting the German advances in the Soviet Union and in North Africa, launching an invasion of Western Europe with the aim of crushing Nazi Germany between two fronts, and saving China and defeating Japan. Public opinion, however, gave priority to the destruction of Japan. So American forces were sent chiefly to the Pacific in 1942-59. In the opening weeks of the war, Japan had conquered the Philippines and the British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia, capturing Singapore in February 1942. Furthermore, Japan cut off the overland supply route to China. The United States flew supplies to China over the hump, the Himalayan mountains, at enormous cost until a road could be opened in 1945. Roosevelt met with Churchill in late December and planned a broad informal alliance among the U.S., Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. This included Churchill's initial plan to invade North Africa, called Operation Gymnast, and the primary plan of the U.S. generals for a Western Europe invasion, focused directly on Germany Operation Sledgehammer. An agreement was also reached for a centralized command and offensive in the Pacific Theater called ABDA, American, British, Dutch, Australian, to save China and defeat Japan. Nevertheless, the Atlantic First strategy was intact, to Churchill's great satisfaction. On New Year's Day 1942, Churchill and Roosevelt issued the Declaration by United Nations, representing 26 countries in opposition to the Tripartite Pact of Germany, Italy, and Japan. 60. China. See also, Second Sino-Japanese War. In 1931, Japan took advantage of China's very weak central government in the warlord era and fabricated the Mukden incident to set up the puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria. Puyi, who had been the last emperor of China, became emperor of China again. He was a Japanese puppet. In 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident triggered the Second Sino-Japanese War. The invasion was launched by the bombing of many cities such as Shanghai, Nanjing, and Guangzhou. The latest, which began on 22 and 23 September 1937, called forth widespread protests culminating in a resolution by the Far Eastern Advisory Committee of the League of Nations. The Imperial Japanese Army captured the Chinese capital city of Nanjing and committed war crimes in the Nanjing Massacre. The war tied down large numbers of Chinese soldiers, so Japan set up 3 different Chinese puppet states to enlist some Chinese support. 61. The United States was a strong supporter of China after Japan invaded in 1937. Even the isolationists who opposed war in Europe supported a hard line against Japan. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 saw aid flow into the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek. 62. American public sympathy for the Chinese was aroused by reports from missionaries, novelists such as Pearl Buck, and Time magazine of Japanese brutality in China, including reports surrounding the Nanjing Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanjing. Japanese-American relations were further soured by the USS Panay incident during the bombing of Nanjing. Roosevelt demanded an apology from the Japanese, which was received, but relations between the two countries continued to deteriorate. By early 1941, the U.S. was preparing to send American planes flown by American pilots under American command, but wearing Chinese uniforms, to fight the Japanese invaders and even to bomb Japanese cities. The Flying Tigers, under Claire Chennault, arrived just as the U.S. entered the war. 63. Chennault had developed an ambitious plan for a sneak attack on Japanese bases. The U.S. military was opposed to his scheme and kept raising obstacles, but it was adopted by top civilian officials including Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury who financed China, and especially President Roosevelt himself, who made it a high priority to keep China alive. 64. By October 1941, bombers and crews were on their way to China. However, the American attack never took place. The bombers and crews arrived after Pearl Harbor and were used for the war in Burma, for they lacked the range to reach China. 65, 66, 67. To augment Chennault's 100 P-40BS. In May 1941, Washington decided to send 144 Vultee P-48s, 125 P-43s, and 66 Lockheed and Douglas medium bombers. The goal was to give China by early 1942 a respectable air force judged by Far Eastern standards, sufficient to a. protect strategic points, b. permit local army offensive action, c. permit the bombing of Japanese air bases and supply dumps in China and Indochina, and the bombing of coastal and river transport, and d. permit occasional incendiary bombing of Japan. 68. Wartime. Chiang Kai-shek, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill meeting at the Cairo Conference in 1943. After the formal declaration of war in December 1941, the U.S. stepped up the flow of aid, but it had to be routed through India and over the Himalayan mountains because Japan blocked the other routes. Chiang's beleaguered government was now headquartered in remote Chongqing. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, 69, who had been educated in the United States, addressed the U.S. Congress and toured the country to rally support for China. Congress amended the Chinese Exclusion Act and Roosevelt moved to end the unequal treaties. However, the perception that Chiang's government, with his poorly equipped and ill-fed troops, was unable to effectively fight the Japanese, or that he preferred to focus more on defeating the communists grew. 70 China hands such as Joseph Stilwell argued that it was in American interest to establish communication with the communists to prepare for a land-based counteroffensive invasion of Japan. The Dixie Mission, which began in 1943, was the first official American contact with the communists. Other Americans, such as Claire Chennault, argued for air power. In 1944, Generalissimo Chiang acceded to Roosevelt's request that an American general take charge of all forces in the area, but demanded that Stilwell be recalled. General Albert Wedemeyer replaced Stilwell, Patrick Hurley became ambassador, and U.S.-Chinese relations became much smoother. Cairo Conference. Main article: Cairo Conference. Chiang Kai-shek of China with Roosevelt and Churchill at the Cairo Conference in 1943. The Cairo Conference, held in Cairo, Egypt, November 23–26, 1943, outlined the Allied position against Japan during World War II and made decisions about post-war Asia. The meeting was attended by President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek of the Republic of China. Soviet General Secretary Joseph Stalin did not attend the conference because his meeting with Chiang could have caused friction between the Soviet Union and Japan. 71. Post-war. After World War II ended in 1945, the showdown came between the nationalists and the communists in a full-scale civil war. American General George C. Marshall tried to broker a truce, but he failed. The Kuomintang, nationalist, military position steadily worsened, and by 1949, the communists were victorious and drove the nationalists from the mainland onto the island of Taiwan and other islands. Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China, PRC, in mainland China, while the Republic of China remains in Taiwan to this day. 72. Soviet Union. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, left, meets with German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop at the signing of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on 23 August 1939. Joseph Stalin controlled the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, with Vyacheslav Molotov as his foreign minister. 73–74. Their policy was hostility to Nazi Germany until August 1939. The Soviet military had conversations in Moscow with a high-level military delegation from Britain and France that led nowhere. The Soviets demanded an agreement from Poland to allow Soviet troops to enter that country to defend it against Germany, but Poland refused. 75. On August 21, Hitler made friendly proposals to Stalin that led to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact on August 23. It stunned the world. The Soviets achieved friendly relations with Germany in order to carve up key elements of Eastern Europe, especially Poland and the Baltic states. Following the pact, Germany invaded and quickly defeated Poland. Then the Soviets invaded and took control of its pre-assigned areas of eastern Poland. Both invaders systematically decimated the Polish elite. In the 1940 Katyn massacre, the NKVD, Soviet secret police, executed 22,000 Polish military and police officers and civilian intelligentsia. 76. For the next 2 years, the USSR supplied Germany with oil and grain. Furthermore, the Kremlin ordered communist parties around the world to denounce the imperialistic war waged by Britain and France against Germany. For example, B. Farnborough says, during the entire period up to the fall of France, the British Communist Party functioned as a propaganda agency for Hitler. 77. After he ignored repeated warnings, Stalin was stunned when Hitler invaded in June 1941. Stalin eventually came to terms with Britain and the United States, cemented through a series of summit meetings. The U.S. and Britain supplied war materials through Lend-Lease. 78. There was some coordination of military action, especially in summer 1944. At war's end, it was doubtful whether Stalin would allow free elections in Eastern Europe. 7980. The central diplomatic issue was future of allies, and as it turned out, this Soviet-Western alliance was not a permanent one. France. See also, military history of France during World War II. French Republic. The Franco-Polish alliance was signed in 1921. France and Britain collaborated closely in 1939, and together declared war against Germany 2 days after it invaded Poland. Apart from the British dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, no independent nation joined their cause. Britain and France took a defensive posture, fearing German air attacks on cities. France hoped the Maginot Line would protect it from an invasion. There was little fighting between the fall of Poland in mid-September and the following spring. It was the phony war in Britain, or drôle de guerre, the funny sort of war, in France. Britain tried several peace feelers, but Hitler did not respond. When Germany had its hands free for an attack in the West, it launched its blitzkrieg against Denmark and Norway, easily pushing the British out. Then it invaded the Low Countries and tricked Britain and France into sending its best combat units deep into the Netherlands, where they became trapped in the Battle of France in May 1940. The Royal Navy rescued over 300,000 British and French soldiers from Dunkirk, but left behind all the equipment. 81. Vichy France. Further information: Foreign relations of Vichy France. Relationships with Germany. Paris fell to the Germans on 14 June 1940, and the government surrendered in the armistice of 22 June 1940, with new leader Marshal Philippe Pétain, 1856–1951. His Vichy regime was authoritarian, Catholic, paternal, and anti-Semitic. His charisma and popularity from his heroic role in the First World War strengthened his authority, although he was increasingly too old to pay attention to details. After Germany seized all of Vichy in October 1942, it installed Pierre Laval as its puppet, leaving Pétain as a helpless figurehead. 82. The armistice included numerous provisions that weakened France, all largely guaranteed by the German policy of keeping 2 million French prisoners of war and workers in Germany as hostages. Vichy France was nominally a neutral country. It never declared war on the Soviet Union or Britain, and was recognized diplomatically by the United States until 1942. Although Vichy France was nominally in control of all of France, apart from Alsace-Lorraine, in practice the Germans controlled 3/5 of the country, including the northern and western coasts, the industrial northeast, and the Paris region. The Pétain government relocated to the resort town of Vichy and controlled the rest. From the start, Germany wanted food, minerals, and industrial productions, as well as volunteers to work in German factories. Vichy was allowed to control its foreign colonies, to the extent it could defend them against the Free French, as well as its fleet, to the extent it could defend it against British naval attacks. In October 1942, Germany took it all over. The Vichy regime became entirely a puppet of the German occupiers. Marshal Pétain left, head of Vichy France, shaking hands with Hitler on October 24, 1940. The small town of Montjoie-sur-Loire was the scene of 2 meetings. On October 22, 1940, Pierre Laval met with Hitler to set up a meeting on October 24 between Hitler and Pétain. It ended in a much-publicized handshake between the two, but in fact, their discussions had been entirely general and no decisions had been made. Hitler was impressed with Pétain's commitment to defending the French Empire. False rumors abounded that France had made major concessions regarding colonies and German control of French ports and the French fleet. 83. Germany controlled the entire French economy and demanded huge reparations in gold and food. However, nearly 2 million French soldiers became prisoners of war in Germany. 84. They served as hostages and forced laborers in German factories. Vichy was intensely conservative and anti-communist, but it was practically helpless. Vichy finally collapsed when the Germans fled in summer 1944. 85. The United States granted Vichy full diplomatic recognition, sending Admiral William D. Leahy to Paris as American ambassador. President Roosevelt hoped to use American influence to encourage those elements in the Vichy government opposed to military collaboration with Germany. Vichy still controlled its overseas colonies, and Washington encouraged Vichy to resist German demands such as for air bases in Syria or to move war supplies through French North Africa. The essential American position was that France should take no action not explicitly required by the armistice terms that could adversely affect Allied efforts in the war. When Germany took full control, the U.S. and Canada cut their ties with Vichy. 86. By 1942, Germany was demanding that Vichy turn over the Jews for deportation to German concentration camps. Reluctantly at first, then more enthusiastically, Vichy complied. They turned over 80,000 of the 330,000 French and foreign Jews living in Vichy. The Germans killed 77,000. When Germany tried to seize the French fleet at Toulon in November 1942, the French Navy scuttled all its ships. French fleet. Britain feared that the powerful French Navy could end up in German hands and be used against its own naval forces, which were so vital to maintaining North Atlantic shipping and communications. Under the armistice, France had been allowed to retain the French Navy, the Marine Nationale, under strict conditions. Vichy pledged that the fleet would never fall into the hands of Germany, but refused to send the fleet beyond Germany's reach by sending it to Britain or to faraway territories of the French Empire such as the West Indies. Shortly after France gave up, it attacked a large French naval contingent in Mers el-Kebir, killing 1,297 French military personnel. Vichy severed diplomatic relations but did not declare war on Britain. Churchill also ordered French ships in British ports to be seized by the Royal Navy. The French squadron at Alexandria, Egypt, under Admiral René-Émile Godfrey, was effectively interned until 1943. The American position towards Vichy France and Free France was inconsistent. President Roosevelt disliked and distrusted de Gaulle and agreed with Ambassador Leahy's view that he was an apprentice dictator. 87. North Africa. Preparing for a landing in North Africa in late 1942, the U.S. looked for a top French ally. It turned to Henry Giraud shortly before the landing on 8 November 1942, but he had little local support. By happenstance, the Vichy leader Admiral François Darlan was captured and supported the Americans. The Allies, with General Dwight D. Eisenhower in charge, signed a deal with Admiral Darlan on 22 November 1942, in which the Allies recognized Darlan as High Commissioner for North Africa and West Africa. 88. The Allied world was stunned at giving a high command to man who days before had been collaborating with the Nazis. Roosevelt and Churchill supported Eisenhower, for he was following a plan that had been worked out in London and had been approved by Roosevelt and Churchill. Darlan was assassinated on 24 December 1942, so Washington turned again towards Giraud, who was made High Commissioner of French North and West Africa. Giraud failed to build a political base and was displaced by the last man with any standing, de Gaulle. 89. Free France. Further information: Free French Forces. General de Gaulle speaking on BBC radio during the war. Free France was the insurgent French government based in London and the overseas French colonies, and led by charismatic General Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle had been a Secretary of State in the last constitutional government in the French Third Republic. From London on 18 June 1940, he gave an impassioned radio address exhorting the patriotic French people to resist Nazi Germany. 90. He organized the Free French Forces from soldiers that had escaped with the British at Dunkirk. With British military support, the Free French gradually gained control of all French colonies except Indochina, which the Japanese controlled. The U.S., Britain and Canada wanted Vichy to keep nominal control of the small islands of St. Pierre and Miquelon for reasons of prestige, but de Gaulle seized them anyway in late 1941-91. When the British and Americans landed in France in June 1944, de Gaulle headed a government in exile based in London, but he continued to create diplomatic problems for the US and Britain. He refused to allow French soldiers to land on D-Day and insisted that France be treated as a great power by the other allies and that he himself was the only representative of France. Churchill, caught between the US and de Gaulle, tried to find a compromise. 36-37. The US and Britain allowed de Gaulle the honor of being the first to march into Paris at the head of his army after the Germans had fled. 92. Axis. Main article, Axis Powers. Animation of the European theater. The dictators of Germany and Italy, Hitler and Mussolini, had numerous conferences. Neither ever met with top Japanese leaders. The Japanese ambassador to Germany handled many of the negotiations between Germany and Japan, but his coded messages home were intercepted and decrypted by the United States starting in 1941. The U.S. shared them with Britain. They revealed important German plans. 93. Germany's foreign policy during the war involved the creation of friendly governments under direct or indirect control from Berlin. A main goal was obtaining soldiers from the senior allies, such as Italy and Hungary, and millions of workers and ample food supplies from subservient allies such as Vichy France. 94. By the fall of 1942, there were 24 divisions from Romania on the Eastern Front, 10 from Italy and 10 from Hungary. 95. When a country was no longer dependable, Germany would assume full control, as it did with France in 1942, Italy in 1943, and Hungary in 1944. Full control allowed the Nazis to achieve their high priority of mass murdering all Jewish population. Although Japan was officially a powerful ally, the relationship was distant and there was little coordination or cooperation, such as Germany's refusal to share the secret formula for making synthetic oil from coal until late in the war. 96. Hitler in action. Di Nardo argues that in Europe Germany's foreign policy was dysfunctional during the war, as Hitler treated each ally separately and refused to create any sort of combined staff that would synchronize policies, armaments, and strategies. Italy, Finland, Romania, and Hungary each dealt with Berlin separately and never coordinated their activities. Germany was reluctant to share its powerful weapons systems or to train Axis officers. There were some exceptions, such as the close collaboration between the German and Italian forces in North Africa. 97-98. Hitler devoted most of his attention during the war to military and diplomatic affairs. He frequently met with foreign leaders, such as the January 10, 1943. He met with Romanian Premier Marshal Ion Antonescu at German field headquarters, with top-ranking generals on both sides. On 9 August 1943, Hitler summoned Tsar Boris III of Bulgaria to a stormy meeting at field headquarters and demanded he declare war on the Soviet Union. The Tsar refused, but did agree to declare war on faraway Britain. American news reports stated that Hitler tried to hit him, and the Tsar suffered a heart attack at the meeting. He died 3 weeks later. 99. Forced labor. Further information. Forced labor under German rule during World War II. German policy was not to use or build factories in occupied Eastern Europe, but to move millions of workers into German factories and farms. 100, some were forced, some went voluntarily going in search of food, and others were prisoners of war. They were closely watched, had poor food and housing, and were harshly treated. Their morale and levels of output were mediocre or poor. 101. At the peak, the forced laborers comprised 20% of the German